For nearly 30 years, my family has owned a pawn shop in North Alabama. This family-owned business has been the training ground for kids and grandkids as we prepared to enter into the workforce. And growing up around the store, I remember watching my family, particularly my dad, as he would move items from place to place around the shop. In particular, I used to enjoy watching him move televisions. I'm not talking about the small, slim TVs that we have today. I'm talking about the big, bulky 27 and 32 inch TVs of yesteryear. What was always so impressive is the superhuman strength that my dad seemed to have. These TVs often feel like they weigh 100 pounds apiece, and he's not a very big man, but he grew up on a dairy farm in Kentucky, and so he's a very strong man. And my dad would take these TVs and he'd pick them up and he'd heave them onto his shoulder and he'd walk around the store taking them from place to place. And I remember thinking to myself, one day I'm going to do that. And you know what? I did. As I came into my teenage years and began working at the shop, I too would begin picking up the televisions and moving them in the same way. I got to the point that I could move the 27 inches and the 32 inches and pick them up, put them on my shoulder, heave them up onto shelves and wherever else they needed to go. And every so often I got a little cocky though, and I would try to pick up something that, well, frankly, it weighed a little too much. I remember times when I would pick up 36-inch televisions and realize after I had gotten it onto my shoulder that it was more than what I could handle. And what would I have to do? I would call out for help because I was not superhuman. When it comes to suffering, many of us treat it the same way. We know that there is a certain amount that we can shoulder on our own, a certain amount of pain that we have the ability to cope with. But inevitably there comes a point in which our suffering becomes greater than what we can carry on our own shoulders. And it's in those times that, unfortunately, we try to act like superhumans, that we try to carry this on by ourselves. And that's not good. Today we want to talk about the fact that when the suffering becomes more than we can bear, we are not alone. There are those that have been put into our lives to help us shoulder that burden. Join Brett as he leads us in this discussion today, realizing that we are not alone through the haze.
His name is Edmund G. Ross. Edmund was chosen to be a United States Senator, but part of the reason that he was chosen to be a senator is because some people in higher power had kind of pegged him as being one that would be on their side. See, it was a time of terrible difficulty in the United States. The Civil War had just occurred, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and Andrew Jackson was in the way, according to their mindsets. They wanted to lead the country in a completely different way than they felt that Andrew Jackson was going to do. They needed Senator Ross to uproot Andrew Jackson. They had calculated that they needed 36 votes to unseat him, and that Senator Ross was going to be that 36th vote. So what occurred was, in the preliminary hearings, as they began to go around and kind of give their opinions on who was going to be voting guilty in order to impeach Andrew Jackson, when it got to Ross, he indicated that he actually felt like perhaps he was not guilty. Of course, this caused an enormous turmoil, and so many people over the following weeks were pressuring him and trying to reach him and convince him to unseat the president. So when the day finally came for the final decision to be made, there was not an empty seat in the House. Everybody was in there. It was packed. Everybody wanted to know what was going to happen to Andrew Jackson. The votes ended up going pretty normal, pretty much as anybody predicted. 35 had voted guilty that President Andrew Jackson should be taken out of office. And then it came to be Edmund G. Ross's turn. As he describes this event, he says something interesting. I looked into my open grave at that moment. Friendship, position, fortune, everything that makes life desirable to an ambitious man were about to be swept away by the breath of my mouth, perhaps forever. Ross realized that the words that were about to come out of his mouth were going to very much isolate him, going to challenge him, going to uproot his family, perhaps even destroy his career. Whereas when it finally came time, with 35 votes of guilty, Ross said, not guilty. It unseated the entire impeachment process, and Andrew Jackson went on to continue to be President of the United States. Unfortunately, Ross predicted exactly what was about to happen. It essentially ended his political career. It unseated him. He had to deal with years of difficulty as a result of doing what he felt was right. It was some 20 years later that people finally realized that Senator Ross had made the correct decision, that the impeachment hearings were unfair, and they ended up changing the laws as a result of it. But it all came because one man was courageous enough to stand alone in the face of these difficulties. I can only imagine how alone he felt, where he has almost all of Congress against him, and he's the lone voice left to try to end this unfair hearing. I can only imagine how alone he felt as essentially the rest of the United States was set against him and his family. It's one thing to have to go through difficulties. It's something completely different when you have to go through those difficulties alone. The difference within the church, though, is we're not alone. We're not alone in our difficulties, and yet sometimes we approach them as if we are alone. I want to take a look at two characters in Scripture and how differently they approached the struggles and difficulties they were going through in their lives. In 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah begins what is going to be one of his lowest moments. What's odd is that it starts very successful, very high. You have all of the prophets of Baal, that there's going to be a competition on Mount Carmel where Elijah is going to essentially issue a test that they should do everything they can in order to get a response from Baal, and that he was going to do the same. Well, they danced around, they called, they cut themselves, they did everything that they could possibly think of to try to get a response from Baal. And of course, no response from Baal. Then it comes Elijah's turn, where, if you remember, he digs the trench around the altar, builds the altar, has water poured all over the sacrifice and in the trench, and he prays to God, and boom, fire from heaven devours everything, dries up all of the water, to show that clearly the God of heaven, Elijah's God, is the one true God. It results in the death of the 450 prophets of Baal, which then makes Jezebel respond, the Queen Jezebel respond in a way to try to take Elijah's life. And that begins what is essentially one of the lowest moments of his life, where he ends up running out into the wilderness, and he ends up finding a tree. And he sits underneath the tree, and he just wishes that his life would end. Why is it that Elijah had this type of reaction in the midst of such a great success? Well, one of the main difficulties that he was trying to face was that he felt alone. He felt like he was the only one who was still faithful to God. He felt like all of these burdens and all of these difficulties that he was trying to shoulder, he was doing alone. When you take a look at the process of his reactions and how he got to the place that he did, why is it that he came to such a low moment? Well, when we take a look in 1 Kings chapter 19, what we see is that first of all, now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and even more, if I do not take your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." So, first of all, and he was afraid. See, Elijah's going to allow fear to really settle in here. But what's odd is, he just had an incredible display of power and support from God. Why would he be afraid of Jezebel? For some reason, in this moment, Elijah allowed the fear to really settle in on the situation. And it's going to cause him, of course, to kind of be paralyzed in the situation, to where instead of facing off with Jezebel or relying on God, he feels like he has to run for his life. And so the fear grips him. As we continue on, and he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. And so not only is he afraid, but he feels like he has to run from his life. He has to run from his problems. Instead of, again, facing them head on or trying to rely on God's power that he had very clearly displayed with the prophets of Baal, instead, he runs. So his mindset has now very much changed to the suffering that he is enduring. He doesn't feel like he can face them. He doesn't feel like he can handle them. Fear grips him, and he runs. Well, if we continue on in verse 4, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, 'It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers.'" So he goes out a day's journey into the wilderness, and what's clear is that he feels very overwhelmed in the situation. But what's odd is perhaps one of the reasons that he felt overwhelmed was because he isolated himself. He has all of these issues, and while he feels alone, he even leaves his servant a day's journey away and continues on by himself. And so now he's sitting underneath a juniper tree by himself, trying to shoulder all of these problems, all of this weight, and it's too much. He's overwhelmed. He's overwhelmed with the difficulties of his situation. And so his response, of course, is negative. Essentially, he wants to give up. It says that he requested that he might die. He doesn't even want to continue on because of how overwhelmed, because of how depressed, and because of how lonely he felt in this situation. Later on, when God brings him up and gives him some food and water and gets him on his way, he comes to a cave, and in verse 10, he gives an explanation of why he feels this way. He said, "I am very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." It's one thing to have to shoulder problems and difficulties of life. It's something completely different when you feel like you're doing it alone. And so this is Elijah's response. He feels like he's the only one going through these troubles, these difficulties. He feels overburdened. He feels overwhelmed. And he says it's too much for him to handle. There's no doubt that Elijah was going through some really difficult times in his life. But some of his responses were self-inflicted, if you will. He didn't have to run. He didn't have to be overcome by fear. He also didn't have to isolate himself and try to shoulder all of these difficulties by himself alone. But he did. And it's certainly no fault of his. He felt alone. He felt overwhelmed. He may not have known what to do. Any human perhaps would have reacted this way. But he didn't have to. Because as it turns out, as God will indicate down in verse 18, that there were still 7,000 left in Israel who had not bowed the knee to Baal. He wasn't alone. There were people that were in the same boat as him. Maybe they felt alone too. But he wasn't alone. And God was trying to explain that he didn't have to react this way. And so God gets him up, gets him on his way, gets him back to work. And of course, Elijah continues on to be one of the greatest prophets that we have ever seen. And God, of course, brings Elijah into heaven in that chariot of fire later on in his life. When we think about this idea of being alone, the idea of being alone comes with many different negatives. Yeah, sure, it can be good to get out by yourself and to be just to be with your own thoughts and to try to sort through things of life, but it's something completely different when you're truly alone. And there can be a lot of dangers and a lot of negatives that come with this idea of being alone. Maybe if we consider a couple of different illustrations, who does the predator look for? Does the predator not look for the one who is alone? Or at the very least, sometimes a pack of lions will try to isolate another animal. In other words, they're trying to get it alone because there is strength in numbers. And it is so much harder to face the difficulties alone. And so predators look for the animal that is alone. But isn't this also what the bully does? In school, the bully is looking for the one who's vulnerable, the one who doesn't have a collection or a support of friends around him or her. The bully is looking for the one that's going to be an easy target. And so that's who the bully ends up hurting or insulting or just punishing. The bully is looking for the one who's alone. But what about criminals? Do criminals not also look for people and for situations in which somebody is alone? They're perhaps looking for the person walking late at night on the street whom they can rob. Or perhaps looking for a young lady coming out of the store alone, or a child that has been separated from the parents. Criminals try to take advantage of someone who's alone because the person doesn't have a support system. But what's even interesting is that loneliness or isolation is used as a punishment. When you think about what our prisons do, they will take a person who has done something wrong in prison and they will subject themselves to isolation, to solitary confinement. It has been shown to be something that can be actually extremely difficult when a person is subjected to isolation. As a matter of fact, just a few years ago here in Colorado, they outlawed isolation, solitary confinement, for a period any longer than 15 days because of the terrible consequences, the psychological effects that it was having on the prisoners. As a matter of fact, in a scholarly article, Craig Haney was taking a look at the psychological impact of incarceration, and particularly how does it influence these prisoners when they try to get back out to normal life afterwards. And when he talks about all of the different negative effects, here are some of the ones that he listed. he said that they begin to have an impaired sense of identity, hypersensitivity to stimuli, cognitive dysfunction, meaning confusion and memory loss and ruminations. They are subject to irritability, anger, aggression, and rage. They also have direct violence towards others, such as stabbings, attack on staff, property destruction, and collective violence. They've also been seen to have a lack of energy and feeling helpless and hopeless, and that they have chronic depression, and that they would even subject themselves to self-mutilation or suicidal impulses, ideas, or behavior. They were struggling with anxiety and panic attacks, emotional breakdowns, and even a loss of control, such as hallucinations, psychosis, paranoia. Overall, he observed a deterioration of mental and physical health. In other words, prisoners that have to go into solitary confinement for a period that they dictated as longer than 15 days are dealing with so many mental, physical, and psychological problems that it was causing them to be, essentially it was in torture, that they were torturing these prisoners. And they were in such terrible parts of their life that nobody should be subjected to such isolation. Well, and yet this is kind of what Elijah is doing to himself. Shouldering burdens, shouldering the weight of everything that he's doing, and then he goes and he takes it into a solitary confinement. He takes it alone to try to handle it, but it's just too much. He can't. It's overwhelming, and he even asks for God to take his life. It's not healthy. It's not beneficial to be overwhelmed with the difficulties of life and then to just try to take them all on our own. I don't know what everyone's been dealing with COVID at home over the last several months, but we know people have been struggling. We know people have been more anxious. We know people have been feeling depressed, been feeling like they have been lacking spiritually, and been dealing with a variety of mental and emotional issues. And yet what just compounds the issue is when we echo Elijah's response and try to almost isolate ourselves, not let anybody shoulder and share the burdens that we're going through, but just try to bear them alone. Have you been feeling maybe a sense of being overwhelmed? Let's stop trying to shoulder these burdens by ourselves. Even Satan looks for people who are alone. He looks for those that are by themselves, or those that are vulnerable, those that he can easily influence. See, it's a lot harder when we're surrounded by others, but he's looking for the one who's alone. Think about 1 Peter chapter 5, where the devil is prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Why is he seeking? Because he's looking for an easy target. He's looking for the one perhaps who's alone, the one who's been shouldering all the burdens, the one who is feeling overwhelmed and is now a more vulnerable target than somebody who has a collection of friends and the church around them to help them through these difficulties. Have you ever considered what Satan did to Job? Yeah, he ended up taking all of his possessions, but one of the things that he ends up doing is removing all of his family. So all of his servants and all of his family are either killed or abandoned him. And he sits there alone, trying to deal with all of the misfortune that's happened in his life. Perhaps that was exactly what Satan was trying to accomplish, was to isolate Job in order to get him to break, to fail spiritually. And of course, it did not work, but it's certainly a tactic of Satan. Why isolate ourselves when we're dealing with difficulty? We need each other. We need help. Scripture often indicates that being alone is not the best way to handle things. You even think about right at the beginning in Genesis 2:18 when God said it's not good for man to be alone. Now, of course, he's talking about companionship. He's talking about a marital relationship. But certainly it was much more than that, because it's going to be a support system, a friendship, something that Adam could share with another person. And that being alone is not the way that God has designed us to be. That doesn't mean that we can't live single. That's not what I'm saying. But we need other people to share burdens, to shoulder the load of life together. Well, you think about what happened in Exodus 18, in verse 18, in which Moses allowed so much of life to be carried only on his shoulders. He was trying to shoulder everything, and he was overwhelmed. And you remember his father-in-law came up to him and said, "This isn't good. You can't handle all of this alone. The responsibility is too much for one person to bear." We go through things in life in which we need to share the responsibilities. Or, of course, what we saw with Elijah in 1 Kings, in which he saw firsthand that being alone was not the way to handle his difficulties. Let's not make an already difficult situation harder by choosing to deal with it alone. Let's do it together. Let's help each other. Let's not echo what Elijah did by choosing to let fear cripple him, to allow the situation to make him want to flee from the difficulty, and then just to isolate himself from it all. Let's choose to go a different path, a better path. And that better path is seen in the Apostle Paul. A different way to react to difficulty is seen in the Apostle Paul. How does one get to the point to where what he says in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 12, "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel." How does one get to the point to where they are able to look at the difficult circumstances that they're in and almost rejoice in them? Well, it's because of the reaction, because of the perspective that Paul had about his suffering. When we break down Philippians 1, 12 through 17, we see that his focus was on anybody but himself. We see that he talks about 5 groups of people, at least 5 groups of people, that were being impacted by him being in prison. He talks about in verse 13 how the whole Praetorian Guard is aware of him being imprisoned and is being influenced by his personality and by his character. In verse 13, it just says, "and to everyone else." So many other people would have been affected by this as well throughout the church or other places. In verse 14, he talks about how the brethren know that he's there. In verses 15 and 16, he talks about there are some good and loving preachers who are speaking out with greater boldness than before. And then even in verse 17, he recognizes that there are some enemies, some selfish preachers that are trying to kick Paul while he's down. But no matter what, his focus is on how all of these different people are being influenced, and hopefully positively, by the fact that he's in prison. Well, why doesn't he ever look at himself? Or Paul could have had a pity party, couldn't he? He could have taken a look and felt really bad about his situation. And yet that's not his perspective at all. It's all about other people. And this shows so much about Paul in his imprisonment. When we break down this text, we see different characteristics and different facets of Paul that come to light as a result of him being in prison. It says in verse 12, "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel." This shows what his attitude is. His attitude is all about the greater good taking place. It has nothing to do with his own personal affliction. His attitude is one that's centered in on better things happening, things outside of himself happening that are greater. But it also says what his focus is, which is the greater progress of the gospel in verse 12. He is much more concerned about the gospel being promoted than himself being promoted. He is more concerned about the freedom of the gospel message than the freedom of himself. We also see in verse 13 that he has a goal. As we continue on, his circumstances turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. His imprisonment resulted in the cause of Christ being well known. Well, his goal is for the cause of Christ to be known to others. For people to come to know Christ, to be influenced by the gospel. That is his attitude. That is his focus. That is his goal. But we can also see that the reason he has this is because of what he loves, which is people. Throughout this entire section of 12 through 17, we see that he talks about several different people that are being positively influenced by his imprisonment. And it's because he loves people. He loves their souls. He wants for them to be saved and have a greater relationship with Christ, which as we continue on is exactly what he says in verse 14. He says, "And that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear." His imprisonment caused people to trust in God more than they did before. Not only that, it caused them to have more courage to speak out and to convert others. See, he wants people to trust in God more because that's what it shows his trusts. It shows his trust in God. But he also wants people to be more courageous because he's been courageous. That's what landed him in prison, is preaching the gospel. This has shown also an incredible example that Paul had been showing to other people. He had been preaching the gospel despite the negative consequences that would come to his life from this. His example is causing people to be closer to God, to trust in God more, and to speak God more boldly than before. What an incredible result of his imprisonment. We also see in verses 15 through 17 who his true friends and his true enemies were. We see those that are trying to kick him while he's down and use his imprisonment to try to discredit him, while others are defending him, helping him, and praying and encouraging him. This situation of his difficulty would have been difficult, but what it showed were many different things about Paul, and even things about other people, and about what they really felt about Paul. When we take a look at these two examples, there are perhaps three truths that we can try to navigate through in the midst of our own difficulties. The first is that things just don't always go the way that we want. We didn't ask for this virus. We didn't ask for this period of difficulty. Nor do we ask for any of the periods of difficulties that we go through in life. But a universal truth is that life doesn't happen the way that we would expect it to go. But the second is where our life is centered will determine our degree of happiness. You don't ever get the sense from Paul that he's unhappy. You get the sense that he's overjoyed, that he's elated, that even though he's suffering, it's resulted in something far greater than himself. And so what his life is centered on determined his happiness. His life was centered on Christ. And so when Christ gets promoted, even in the midst of his difficulty, he's happy. Because that's really what his life is all about. The third truth is that every person gets to determine how we will respond to our difficulties. We may decide to respond kind of like Elijah, where we let the fear cripple us, where we decide to kind of run from the issues instead of trusting in God. and then to even isolate ourselves, trying to shoulder the burdens all alone. Well, the result for Elijah was not good. But we could choose to take a perspective like Paul, where we look at our circumstances and we say, well, how is God's cause being furthered from this? What can I do to be a better servant of God through these difficulties? But the fourth universal truth is this: you don't have to be alone. We have the church. We have people who want to be here to help. And so we don't have to go through these things alone. We don't have to shoulder this alone. And so it's a matter of choice if we do. The Bible says a lot about this idea of being alone and how ultimately there's so much more strength and value in numbers. For example, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 9 through 12 says, "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart." There is strength in numbers. There is strength in us relying on each other, helping each other, bearing each other's burdens. When you think about what Paul said just in the next chapter in Philippians chapter 2, he was talking about the idea of how they can better support themselves, how they can better navigate through their difficulties. And it came with a selflessness, looking outside of ourselves and realizing that ultimately, no matter the difficulty we go through, we're trying to further God's kingdom. And so he says in Philippians chapter 2, 3 and 4, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests in others." Not only is there strength in numbers, as Solomon showed us, but sometimes people are going to try to shoulder their burdens by themselves. Which is why we need to try to be the people that are not focusing on ourselves, but with humility trying to help each other out, help them bear their burdens, and think about what they're going through and how they might be feeling so that they can better handle the load. And then, of course, Hebrews chapter 3 in verse 13, "But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." We need to encourage each other and help each other. Because when we go through stuff alone, it gets discouraging. It gets disheartening. We feel hopeless and helpless. And we need the encouragement so that we are not hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Quite literally, souls are on the line. We need to be people that are trying not to just do things alone, but to rely on the help from others. And then in addition to that, reaching out specifically to help others. Life is going to happen. The struggles and difficulties of this life we're living right in the midst of them right now. And as sad as it is, it's not going to stop here probably. There's going to be something else down the line. There's going to be perhaps another virus or another situation or another difficulty. But one of the worst things that we can do is to try to shoulder it alone. One of the worst things that we can do is to further afflict ourselves with isolation and solitary confinement, trying to bear the burden all by ourselves. Isn't this what the church is for? To help each other, to pray with each other. No matter what you're going through, please realize you're not alone. There are people who want to help. There are people that stand ready to help. So reach out for help. Don't do it alone, because you're not alone.
Brett, excellent job. Thank you so very much for leading us through that study. You know, as you and I have discussed this topic of not being alone, reaching out for help, one of the things that occurs to me is that the reason we tend to not do this, something that would prevent us from reaching out, is a very biblical subject, and it's simply the idea of pride. That we become so prideful that we can't make ourselves take that step. I think particularly of men. I think men have a big problem with this, and yes, we laugh and joke, but at the same time, there's reality to it. You know, men are the guys that don't stop for directions. They don't want to read the instruction manual. We've been told that if there's a problem, we have to fix it. And I also think of the idea of embarrassment, that pride comes into play. If we find ourselves in a pickle and we are suffering as a consequence of something we've done, our pride will say, well, I got myself into this, surely I can get myself out. And we don't want to risk the embarrassment of asking for help because of something that we created.
Yeah, we need to start getting into the mindset of it's okay to not be superhuman.
Yeah.
Because we're not. We're not superhuman. And I don't know why we tend to be in this mindset to where we feel like we have to really shoulder the whole thing by ourselves. And that if I let anybody else in, it's weakness. Because it's just not that way. Matter of fact, I would even argue that it takes more strength to say, I need some help. I need somebody to come shoulder this burden with me, than it would be to try to shoulder it alone and let people go, oh, wow, look how amazing he is or she is. We're not superhuman. We need to stop trying to be superhuman. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say, I'm human. It's okay, as Corey pointed out in sermons several weeks ago, to give ourselves some grace, to realize that we make mistakes, to realize that that we can't handle everything in life, and to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and let people in. We actually really like it when people ask it of us. At least I do. I love it when somebody feels comfortable enough to say, hey, Brett, would you mind helping me out with something like this? It feels good. It's an honor. And we want to help. And in a sense, that's kind of our Christian duty, right? We are to be, they will know we are Christians by our love, is the song that we sing. Yeah. Well, how are we supposed to show love for each other if nobody reaches out for help? It's almost as if we expect people to just be mind readers, to know when we need help, and to be able to figure this all out. I might even say it to this level. We might be handicapping the amount of love that we could be showing by not asking others for help. If we're supposed to show we're Christians by our love, but we don't know if somebody needs help, how am I supposed to adequately show the love? We can show greater love when people ask for help, and then we can respond to that.
And I would add to that the handicapping of showing love. It's not just that we don't ask for it, but even when people can perceive that we need the help, when we refuse the help consistently. So both of those are things that prevent us from being able to show that Christian love and be able to help one another. So Brett, one of the things we've tried to do in all of our classes is at the end we try to give some practical applications. What are some things that we can do from here on that will help us live out these principles and these truths that we are finding from Scripture regarding suffering?
Well, and I think this is one that's going to be a little bit more direct. And that is, if you need help, please contact someone. Please talk to someone. Corey and I are always available. I know our elders are always available. And there may be someone else that you feel comfortable with that you could reach out to, but don't try to shoulder all this alone. If you have been struggling at all, please don't shoulder it any longer. Reach out for help. And I guess that's really kind of just the direct line that we've been talking about all class and even now. And that is just, take that step. It might be uncomfortable. It might, again, kind of feel like you're showing weakness, but setting pride aside, just reach out for help.
And I would add to this as well, yes, we are all having difficulty, but some of us have reached a point where maybe we are not struggling as badly as we were before.
Right.
Let me offer a suggestion that is more preemptive. If you are at that point that maybe you don't need immediate help, this would be a great time to start setting up a support system that would be there when you do have those times. So just as an example of how this could work, reach out to 2, 3, 4 people at the church that you feel comfortable with, and just begin checking in on one another once a week. Get a little message group of some kind, whether it's text messaging or some other kind of social app, and make it a point to check in on one another, pray for each other regularly, and if you begin building that rapport, when the time comes that one of you needs extra help and support, the system will already be in place, and you will already have dealt with some of the fear and the potential anxiety of reaching out to somebody to ask for that help.
Yeah, it takes away some of the uncomfortableness of the first step.
Right.
Maybe one other facet that is important to talk about, or at least kind of lead into, is this. It may be that there are some things going on that are on a much more serious and a much deeper level that just quite frankly, Corey and I are not trained to be able to handle. And what we're talking about are some of the much more serious aspects of depression and anxiety that could be happening that need more of a professional approach. We're not going to talk about that too much right now, but in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an interview with some people that have more expertise than we do that can start hitting on perhaps an even deeper level of some of these feelings that might be happening behind the scenes.
Brett, again, thank you very much. Looking forward to continuing this study in the few weeks that we have left. As we wrap this up, one of the things that we want to make sure you are aware of is that you have the ability to drop us a note. We would love to get feedback from you on whether or not our discussions have been helpful. If there are some other things that maybe somehow we can touch on and find out what the Bible says about suffering that maybe you are going through, or questions that you have had, we'd love for you to drop us a note either in the comments down at the bottom of the YouTube page, or you can drop us an email, which you can get through the Bear Valley Church of Christ website. That's always a thing that's open for you to do. But for now, we're going to sign off, and we are grateful that you have been with us this week, and we hope that you will join us again next week as we continue our study through the Haze.